Before starting research on this, I professed to know bugger all about the Boer War. Don't believe I'm alone in this desertion of historic duty. There was that Australian film, Breaker Morant, in the 80s. Then this abridged version of a book I read in the 90s. At first I thought the lack of coverage in celluloid and print could be down to because of the involvement of the tactics to deprive the locals of resources, including women and children, in the second phase of the conflict, meant that it all should be swept under the carpet out of shame. Coupled with the belief a farming nation like New Zealand held closer affinities to the Boers more than the commander of, say, the British forces who attended an elite school in Switzerland. That all meant we worked out sometime later we shouldn't have got involved. Simply we had a rush of blood to the head. Perhaps it was one or two of those reasons that account for the lack of coverage 120 odd years later. I was wrong. The scant history is more down to the low death toll for a modern war, even one with new guns with the firing power of, say, a Maxim. Just 228 would lose their lives in 2.5 years of the conflict. I'll break down that number of Kiwis later on, versus 18,000 that would die in World War One a decade and a bit later. The Boer War involved days and weeks of men on horses in sun and cold, chasing shadows, on a monotonous diet of bully beef and biscuits for the ones with 2 legs, and oats going down the craws of the 4-legged creatures. Richard Seddon was handed the December 1899 election on a plate when war was on the cards in South Africa. The jingoistic expressions of Seddon best summed up the feelings of New Zealanders at the time. "We have been called by Mother England. Is there a son amongst us who would shrink from that call?" In a state of patriotic fervour, before Britain actually declared war on the South African Republic, plans were already afoot for New Zealanders to be the first feet and hooves on South African soil, supporting Mother England. In less than 2 weeks, the first of 10 contingents were at Wellington Port, chafing at the bit. 215 men were soon boarding the Waiwera, cheered on by the crowd. That's a photo of the events I'm describing. The troops of the first waving goodbye. Next is the oldest known moving film shot in New Zealand, and that was at the second contingent. About 30 seconds of footage of that parade taken at Newtown Park 2 months later is in the link that's staring back at you. As mentioned, the first contingent was 215, the next 206. The 10th and last would be 1,251. Those first men were part of the small standing force, what we would now call territorials today, or volunteers. The actual number of volunteers was massively oversubscribed. The army could be very choosy. Throughout the war, Kiwi volunteers who missed out regularly sailed off to the other Commonwealth countries with lower criteria. Over 1,000 of them ended up in South Africa fighting in a different uniform. By now, you're probably wondering what could have enticed men in their late teens and 20s to travel to a strange land and have a local farmer take pot shots at them from a distance of 1 kilometre. I will answer this in one word: adventure. Besides, Saving Private Ryan wouldn't be released for a good century. This wasn't one-way traffic. In my research, I discovered the Boers had support from overseas volunteers sympathetic to their cause as well. 7,500 volunteers turned up on the velds of their own accord. Unsurprisingly, the largest group came from the Benelux country, but the next highest contributors were from Ireland and Irish Americans, along with Germans, French, Swedes, Poles, Russians, and even Greeks. The motto, "Enemy of my enemy is my friend," was in action. Back to New Zealand and the initial criteria. Knowing the conditions they were facing, the ability to ride a horse was placed ahead of accuracy with a gun. You would be both right and wrong looking at the photo of the seconds if you thought, hell, that was quick work on behalf of the government to stump up for a kit and suitable horse, when those very volunteers who were risking their life and limb had to supply their own. Only the standing force got a free nag. It was left to the public to address this anomaly and injustice, and district was set against district to raise the most funds. An interesting offshoot of the crowdsourcing was the advent of an all-female khaki corps, like the fine ladies from the Greymouth pictured, who would do military displays and embarrass unwilling menfolk. I dare say there's a few dairies and jewellers around town who would be willing to support their reintroduction. The Wellington Amazonians wouldn't be shooting just to wound ram raiders. Daughter of the Prime Minister, Sergeant Elizabeth Seddon, is second from the left in the back row. In another imperialistic exercise that came courtesy of London via India, a troop of Sikhs was sent on a nationwide tour to drive more nails into the propaganda that this is a Commonwealth affair. That propaganda painted the largely Dutch Boers as being pawns of the Germans, which was true if you looked at where the Boers were getting their weapons from, along with Russia. Whilst I'm on the subject of women and auxiliaries, New Zealand nurses, doctors, vets, blacksmiths, etc. all made contributions. Building a functional fighting force, also 20 teachers, dubbed the Learned 11th. 20 female teachers that were sent to educate, or was that re-educate, the children of farmers sent to the barbed wire encampments we know as concentration camps today. Let's deal with the thorny issue and the role in the second phase of the war from June 1900, which saw Boers engage in guerrilla tactics and the British scorched earth and naval blockades. On paper, when it started, this was a conflict that should have only gone just a few months. It had now become a war of attrition that saw 200,000 civilians relocated to concentration camps where 28,000, mostly children, would die. To the shame of the British, and by extension New Zealand, more children would die of disease than their fathers died fighting the British. Whilst I don't want to sound an apologist for the actions of New Zealand troops in this sorry affair, I would like to indicate right from the start, troops and those from other imperial forces found themselves doing the heavy hauling. Top of that list was Kitchener deploying New Zealand and Australian troops to do their dirty work in the form of burning farms to the ground. Most Kiwi soldiers, and particularly those from rural backgrounds, weren't keen on this development one bit. "We are sick of making war on women, chicken and cattle," is a quote from one. In a forgotten, shameful exercise, there was the deportation of a large number of Boer prisoners, incorporating, I might add, just for the hell of it, a fair splattering of boys who were seen as future fighters and men aged 60 plus, who were exiled en masse to the relative specks in the Atlantic, in St Helena and Bermuda. On both sides, in towns, camps and the backcountry, disease, mostly in the form of typhoid, was rampant, which accounted for by far the most majority of the deaths. I mentioned earlier the New Zealand death toll was 228, and just 70 of those were killed in action. Since the 4th contingent is about to become our focus, let me break down those figures for you. Their story being a good cross-section of the war for New Zealanders in general. Hopefully, I'm painting a picture of what it was like to be on the ground, which is where the troops largely slept on patrols. Back to the story. It was therefore up to the public to come to the rescue of the 265 troops of the 3rd and 467 of the 4th contingents. Estimated time of departure, February and March 1900. It would take another year of diplomatic moaning from New Zealand before Britain funded the Kiwi forces fighting in South Africa, starting from Contingent 5. The 3rd and 4th contingents were nicknamed the Rough Riders. The 4th would be made up of 2 companies from the North Island and 2 from the South. In Wairarapa, trials were held for the allocated spots. 140 competed in 2 well-attended trials to find the best man for the job from the district. Those are the winners from Masterton. I want to make it clear here though, such was the enthusiasm to join the contingents travelling overseas, keen men would turn up where they thought they had a show. The 4th included 2 notable members amongst their numbers. The first was Major, the horse. Horses played a major pivotal role in the war on all sides. New Zealand beasts were renowned as being superior to those from Britain and Australia, were capable, under different circumstances, to be racing around the tracks and not the vast plains of South Africa. 8,000 would sail off, just Major would return. Major was one of the 250 to accompany the 4ths on board the SS Bubonic. The treatment and conditions faced by those animals on that particular sailing were appalling. Having been left out in the open in the cold and rain before embarking at Port Chalmers, pneumonia saw that number reduced before they'd even got out of territorial waters. During the fighting, Major would suffer 2 wounds. If a Fitbit was a thing back then. Over his time in the field, 1 bullet went through his knee and another resided in his shoulder. He strolled along till at the close of hostilities he went to England and was actually ridden in the coronation of King Edward VII in 1902. The household name finally got back to New Zealand in 1903 after a period of quarantining. When Major died in Gisborne in May 1909, every newspaper in the country covered the story. And then we have as part of the 4th, William Hardham, who became the 2nd New Zealander to win a Victoria Cross, the only recipient in the Boer War. A tiger for punishment, he did 2 stints. For this reason, calculating how many Kiwis it exactly served is made harder by those who made more than 1 deployment. And then for good measure, now weigh closer to 40 than 30, he was one of the first to sail off to World War I, where he was wounded at Gallipoli. As touched on, the 4ths were from around the entire country, like these fine gentlemen from Central Otago, who didn't appear to have a belt shop in close vicinity. I lost my notes on this one. It looks like possibly a Clyde in Central Otago to me. I'm sure someone will know and put it in the comments. Anyway, the general plan was for the North Island contingent to travel from Auckland to Wellington, then to Dunedin, and then embark on the SS Bubonic at Port Chalmers, make a quick final stop at Lyttelton. Then, after endless public parading, off they would finally sail as one group. This went to plan and schedule until the North Islanders reached Port Chalmers on board a vessel called the Monowai, only to discover the Bubonic was tied up to the dock, with literally 100 carpenters and shipwrights beavering away. The departure was to be delayed. 3/4 of the contingents were now offloaded. More parades were held. After a week's delay and the horses spending a wet and cold night out in the cold, boarding occurred. Within a short time it was discovered the vessel had an issue with animal effluent stinking the place to high heaven. The lower ranks also found themselves sleeping beside their charges in unhygienic conditions. The vessel was promptly disinfected and a new accommodation arrangement knocked up, causing another delay. Before now 2 weeks late, the vessel travelled north to Lyttelton. On that short journey, it became apparent the conditions were still less than satisfactory, even for inshore sailing, by which time the first horses had started to die. There was no air circulation and the smell of animal and human waste was pervasive. Half the crew came down with dysentery, and then for good measure the water was foul tasting. Happy days. Come on guys, it's not like there was the bubonic plague breakout happening in Australasia at the time, was it? whilst the Canterbury contingent were holding an open day for the public at Addington Raceway, and down at Lyttelton 100 of the forces had ignored orders and left the vessel, refusing to reboard until things were sorted out. As the rebellious troops congregated around the port, the army was in a bit of a pickle and wasn't wanting this debacle to get into the newspapers nor turn nasty. They put it on their politicians to sort out the mess. Seddon was contacted and a list of demands was read out. Remarkably, a copy of the mutinous troops' petition still remains today. Seddon conceded to all their demands. More cleaning occurred, water issues sorted, and commitment made for an extra unscheduled resupply stop in Australia. After the troops had their concerns placated by the Prime Minister, more dousing of quarters and flushing of water tanks, the SS Gimerick departed Lyttelton 27th of March 1900, and it would be a month before they arrived in Beira. Beira, I hear you say. Famous place, Mozambique. It would take another 2 months of trains and trekking before they even reached the front line. The 4th contingent would serve from April 1900 till June 1901 before they headed home from South Africa. This was a typical tour of duty. In summary, I could never hope to cover a subject like this without doing a full documentary, but as a lone amateur researcher and zero-budget producer, that's well beyond my scope. It was exhausting enough doing the research and making only the second video focusing on New Zealanders in South African War here on YouTube. It would really help my cause greatly if you shared this video and stuck around to watch another of mine like this one. Hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for sticking right to the end. Bye for now.